So I can start? Cool. Hi, everyone. My name is Janice, and there's my co-author, Domen. So we're from the University of Oxford, and first I wanted to thank the conference committee for giving us this opportunity to talk to you about one of our passions, which is blind tasting. If you look at our kind of departments here, it sounds like the start of a really bad joke, because I'm an experimental psychologist and he's a theoretical chemist. So what are we doing here at a wine economist conference? Well, so it happens that what we do have in common, other than being married, is the fact that we both run the Oxford University Blind Tasting Society. So for those of you who might not be familiar with blind tasting, it doesn't mean that we're blindfolded and we taste things. What it means is that we train people to, if you have a glass of wine, based on only what the color is, what you smell and what you taste in the glass, we train you how to guess where the wine is from, down to country, region, sub-region. And also we train you on guessing what is a grape variety and what is the vintage. And I know that this morning Elliot Morse mentioned something about wine judges being unable to tell the quality of the wine. And I want to stand here and say, no, that's not necessarily true. And in fact, we can actually train people to deduce something from the glass of wine that you're holding. So, Oxford has this very peculiar tradition of competing against Cambridge. So you might have heard of the boat race every year between Oxford and Cambridge. But what you might not know is that there is a very old tradition of a blind wine tasting competition between Oxford and Cambridge. So this year was actually the 65th year. Both Domen and I have competed in the competition. I was captain for 2 years, and Domen was the captain this year, and all 3 times we beat Cambridge, so yay. But so here are just some pictures. I'm really proud of the one on the bottom left of me with Jancis Robinson when I got top taster 2 years ago. So there's my name dropping moment. So how does the competition work? So it takes place in 2 flights. You get 6 whites and 6 reds from anywhere in the world. So it's not like, in French competitions, the French only want to show you French wines because they think it's the best. In the UK, they're a bit more open-minded. So we basically train and we are tested on wines from anywhere in the world that makes enough wine to be imported to the UK. And you can see on the top left that all the wines are not only blind, they decant them into standard size bottles. So you can't try to guess what the wine is by the shape of the bottle. And we have 14 minutes for each flight of whites and reds, and I'll show you later what what the scoring card looks like. So last year, one of our friends who works for The Economist wrote an article about the Oxford Cambridge blind tasting competition, and he also wrote up a little data sheet on, does blind tasting actually work? Now, he only took the data from the day of the competition, which was 12 people, 12 wines. So it's a very limited set of data. And he was saying that based on this very limited set of data, you can see that people can do better than chance when it comes to blind tasting. So we were inspired by his piece to see whether we can actually observe the entire training session that we do each year and see if over about 20 sessions can people actually reliably get better. And then I will talk about what we meant by better. So we had 5 different criteria for measurement, which I'll mention in a second. So the training session we do every year, so the competition is usually in mid-February. So we have 18 sessions this year, starting from January 13th to February 17th, because the competition was, I think, on the 20th. So for each session, there was about 2 to 3 hours, because we do one flight of 40 minutes, and then we discuss the wines, and then we do the other flight. And what you see on the box here is the day number, so day 1 through day 36, and all the blue colors are the days when we had training sessions where we collected the data sheets. So like I said, we have 12 wines, 6 whites, 6 reds at each time that they're decanted into clear bottles. And this is what the tasting sheet looks like that people have to fill out. So for each wine here, they have to say, what is the predominant grape variety? So there were some talks about blends this morning, and I have a talk about blends tomorrow. But for the purpose of the competition, all the wines have to be at least 75% of a dominant grape variety. So we can train people on distinguishing the traits of specific grape varieties. And then people have to guess, what's the country country of origin, what's the major viticultural region, and the sub-district. So for example, if you have a Polyak, the country would be France, the major viticultural region would be Bordeaux, and then the sub-district would actually just be left bank. And then we also have to guess the vintage of the wines, and then we write a tasting note, so basically describing the color of the wine, the smell, the taste, and also the structural elements. So what is the alcohol? Is it low, medium, or high? What is the acidity? Is it low, medium, or crisp, or high? Does it have oak? Does it have tannins? So these are the things that we train people to be able to describe and write in a very small box. And for the purpose of the study, we also added a box that says preference, because we were curious whether the accumulation of wine expertise will actually change people's wine preference. Because when you're in the real world, hey, that's what really matters, is how do people's preferences change with exposure. I think I will talk about that in a bit. So we had about actually 20 people who came to some of the tastings, but at the end, after we gathered all the data, we decided to take only the people who attended at least 9 out of the 18 tasting sessions. Now, in the ideal world, as a psychologist, I would have preferred if everybody came to all the sessions all the time. But people had exams. Many people were sick, because January is not a good time to be in the UK. So we ended up with 15 people who attended at least half of the sessions. Out of them, 9 of them had no initial blind tasting training experience. And we had 6 people who were basically returning members from the team. And I wanted to make that distinction. And overall, it was a lot of work, because we had over 2,000 tasting notes plus guesses of grape, country, region, vintage that we analyzed. So over the 18 sessions, we had 212 wines. And again, I just want to say that as a psychologist, I would have preferred if I could have controlled all the wines that we tasted. But this was more of an observational study, because we invited wine educators to come and give a presentation. So we couldn't control which wines were being shown, so we didn't know. We just told them, show wines that are available in the UK for sale. So they spanned a wide range, as you'll see in a second. Of all the wines, we had 82 from France, so that was the highest country, and about 64 from the New World, so anywhere that's non-Europe. And just a little bit of breakdown, just to show you what we're dealing with here. In terms of the white grape varieties, we had 23, and so Chardonnay and Riesling were basically the highest components of that. In terms of red grape varieties, we had 21 of them. Now, whether it's Syrah or Shiraz, from France or from Australia, I basically grouped them together because they're the same grape. So Syrah, Cabernet Sauvignon, and Pinot Noir were the 3 highest, most frequently represented wines we had. Now, we had wines from 14 different countries total that happened to be shown in the 18 sessions, with France being almost 40% of them. And just really quickly, in terms of regions, I just want to say that we tasted wines from 44 different regions. So this was not, back in the day, the Oxford-Cambridge match was basically, can you tell your Burgundy from Bordeaux? Nowadays, it's much more complicated. We're actually tasting wines from a great range. So this is not a very easy challenge. And in terms of vintage, the vintages span from 2005 to 2017, but as you can see on the histogram here, most of the vintages were within the last 3 or 4 years, fairly recent. And in terms of price distribution, again, we couldn't control which wines they brought, but we did tell them that the average price of the wines that are shown on the competition is around 15 pounds, Great British pounds. So that's about $22. So the range of our wines went from about £650 to about £35, with a mean of 15. And you can see the histogram here that the majority of the prices of the wines that we trained on were somewhere between 10 and 20 pounds. So we were not training on first growth Bordeaux or Grand Cru Burgundies, because that's how they did the competitions about 20, 30 years ago, not how we do it now. So we had 5 hypotheses about how training might increase people's accuracy, depending on how you define accuracy. So the first hypothesis was that training will reduce the within-group variability of guesses. So within the group of people you have, as they get more experienced, there might be a total of fewer and fewer guesses. So people start clumping together in terms of their guesses. And the second hypothesis is maybe the most obvious, which is that training will make participants more accurate in their guesses, whether it's the guessing for the grape variety, or for the country, or for the region, or for the vintage. And the third hypothesis is because we focus on training people how to distinguish structural elements. So is the acid low or high? Is the alcohol low or high? So we predicted that training would make people more accurate in the structure assessments. And fourth, we thought that people would change the way they write their tasting notes as they became more experienced. And fifth, dealing with preference. So I had a theory that with more exposure to wine tasting, they might come to prefer more mature or more structured wines. So did we see any of that? So first of all, in terms of within group variability, again, we would expect people to agree more within themselves as time went on. Whether they were right or not is a separate matter. So I defined this measure of basically the number of tasters at the session divided by the total number of guesses. So this is kind of a measure of the number of consensus groups. The size of the consensus group you had. And what we saw was that it was a correlation with time. The one that actually had a significant correlation was grape variety. So in other words, as the training time went on, the size of the kind of agreement groups got bigger in terms of grape variety. And here's a regression chart, so you can see we have a trend going up. In other words, more and more people agreed on what grape variety this could be as time went on. Now, this brought up another question, which is, in a session with the blind tasting guesses, is the most frequent guess actually correct? Or are people just agreeing on the wrong guesses? So I did analysis of how often is the most common guess correct. So you can see here that for grape it was about 44%. For country it was actually 50% of the time the most common guess was correct. For region it was about 33%, and for vintage it was about 37%. Now I wanted to see if this was higher than chance. This color was a little bit different from what I expected. So sorry, this was supposed to be red, and it's a bit hard to see. But what I compared it to was based on the distribution of wines that were actually shown. Is simply, if you were just guessing the most frequently shown options, is it better or worse than people's most common guesses? And I just wanted to show that there's actually a significant difference. So people's most common guesses was not only more accurate than random chance, it was also more accurate than the most frequently shown grapes, if that makes sense. And sorry about the color there, it was supposed to be red, it didn't show up that way. So the second hypothesis we had was on guess accuracy. And we decided to focus on grape variety, country, region, and vintage. So as training went on, do people actually get more accurate? And again, what we saw was that for grape variety, that was the case. So on the y-axis, we have the number of guesses correct per session. So really, out of 12, how many grape varieties did people get right on average? And as you see, that has a positive correlation. And interestingly enough, people got worse on vintage guesses as time went on. And another analysis I did a multivariate ANOVA, looking at, well, is there a difference in how much prior experience people had? And then we saw a big difference between the people for whom it was their first time doing training versus people who had been training in previous years. And there's actually quite a big difference. If you look at just grape variety, novices on average got 2.56 out of the 12 grape variety right per session, whereas the more experienced people got 4.41. And that was also true for country, where we had almost 5 countries correct out of 12 for the experienced people versus 3.4 for the people with no prior experience. And I want to see that the vintage is more of a wild card, because while we saw a difference in grape variety, country, and region, there was really no difference in vintage, in how good people were in guessing vintage. So maybe that was the hard thing. And another analysis I did with the ANOVA is I broke down the sessions into the first half and the second half to be able to see, so numerically speaking, what is the improvement? So you can see that for grape variety, the average number of grape varieties that people guessed right in the first half of the sessions was about 3.1, whereas for the second half of the session it was about 3.8, and that was a significant difference. And again, quite funny, you can see that for vintage, people actually did get worse as time went on.
Can you tell us 3.1?
Out of 12.
Out of what? 4?
Yeah, out of 12 grape varieties usually shown at a session, yeah. So in summary, the grape variety accuracy did improve with training, even within this span of 36 days. But also the prior experience helps, because the people who were returning members did much better than the people for whom it was their first time. Now, I wanted to address really quickly this thing with vintage. How come people didn't get better with vintage? So one thing we observed was that if you're a first-time person, you're trying to guess, country grape variety. Usually, you didn't have time to think about vintage, and you usually just put down the most recent vintage that was available. Whereas as soon as you got a bit more confident, more experienced, you started thinking, oh, I can guess the vintage really well. So it might be a 2016, but you'd guess 2014, then you get it wrong. And if you look at the vintage distribution, the safest strategy is to actually just guess the most recent vintage. Now, really quickly about structural accuracy, we tracked 2 things, so acidity and alcohol. For acidity, we arranged the wines, we categorized the wines in terms of low, medium, crisp, and high acidity. And for alcohol, it was low, medium, high. So for alcohol, anything below 12% was low, 12 to 13.5 was medium, and anything 14 or higher was considered high. So I want to show this graph. So what we saw was that for acidity, people did get more accurate in terms of their acidity assessment. So if you look at the magnitude of the error, that went down with time. And actually, the trend was that at first people were underestimating acidity, and as time went on, they actually started to slightly overestimate acidity. But if you look at the magnitude of the error, that's a net negative. But if you look at alcohol, we didn't see any trends with time. But alcohol was always hovering around the 0% error. So in general, people were actually quite good at estimating alcohol. And the fourth hypothesis had to do with linguistic analysis, because we did collect these tasting notes. And my background was in computer science with natural language processing, so I was curious if we can say something about the way people wrote their tasting notes. So here are some examples. And these were participants for whom it was their first time doing blind tasting training. So for both instances, they thought the wine was a white Sancerre. So it's a Sauvignon Blanc from the Loire. So you can see that on day 2, the tasting note was much shorter and more concise than the tasting note from session 18, so on the last day, when they were much more descriptive in what they tasted in the wine. And a similar example from another participant, actually, they thought the wine was a Chilean Cabernet Sauvignon in both cases. And again, you see this much more descriptive tasting note by the last session. So this inspired me to think, well, does tasting note change over time? So I did a basic word count analysis. And basically, novices used fewer words than experienced people. But I actually didn't see any changes in tasting note length or vocabulary size over time, which makes me think that maybe the way you write tasting notes is something that is a slower process than just 36 days. But something really interesting that came out of the analysis was this association between tasting note length and wine preference, where if it's a wine that you like, you're writing a longer tasting note. And this was a very, very clear result that we saw, which I thought was interesting. And this might explain why some wine critics will write 1,000-word tasting notes for a wine that they really like. So our last hypothesis had to do with preference. And for me, this was really the most interesting one. And I had a hypothesis that most beginners don't really like mature wines. They don't like acidity. They want wines that are fresh and oaky and young. But is that actually true? So based on the whole session, just to say, the least preferred wine overall was this Gewürztraminer. That wasn't really that interesting. Whereas the most preferred wine was a Willi Hag Auslese Riesling. So this was quite sweet. And I thought this was a good example of going against the usual stereotype of people don't like sweet wines. In fact, we did quite like sweet wines when it was balanced and interesting. So I apologize, this might be a bit small. So what I did here was I looked at people's preferences and ran correlations with some attributes of wines. And overall, people preferred older wines, wines with higher acidity and sweetness. Red wines, which in general preferred more than whites. And this was actually really interesting, which is that even though all the wines were tasted blind, there was a clear correlation between preference and the price of the wine, that it actually was. So unlike what Elliot said this morning about people can't tell the difference between price, I think there's some element of price-preference correlation. And when we only look at the novices, so the people for whom it's their first time, we don't see the preference for acidity anymore, but we do see a preference for oak and a preference for wines from the New World, which I think part of it is explained by the oak. So, and then I went back to my computer science training and I trained a naive Bayesian model looking at people's choice of tasting note words, because I wanted to see which words in the tasting note was most indicative of their preference. So on the left, we have novice tasters. On the right, we have experienced tasters. So you can see, for example, for the novice tasters, words like botrytis and baking, and I think baking is part of baking spices. These are the words that were most indicative of a higher preference wine. Whereas for the more experienced tasters, there were words like, we had raisins at first, but also age, break, tar, honey, mushroom. So I think this is showing that more experienced tasters prefer age, whereas more novice tasters prefer sweetness or oak or things that are more, perhaps, easier to detect. And finally, we were curious if people actually changed their preference over the duration of the training session. So first, looking at all the participants overall, I ran a multiple regression on people's preference, and you can see that between the first half of the session and the second half of the session, the preference for red wines went down, but the preference for older wines went up. So over the training session, people started preferring more older wines. And if you look at only the people for whom it's their first time, and I think this is really interesting, so between the first half and the second half, the effect of oak on preference goes away, but instead what you start picking up is they start appreciating older wines, and also they start appreciating wines with higher acidity and alcohol. So it's this emphasis on wine structure, so beyond just whether it's red or white or whether it has oak or not. So in general, for everybody, the shift in preference went towards older wines. And of course, just to say, the wines that we tasted were between 2005 to 2017, so they were not necessarily 30, 40 years old, so they were a little bit older. And also the preference for red wine went down as training went on. And especially for novices, I think it's very interesting to see this. The oak became less important, but acidity and alcohol, so the structural elements became more important. So in summary, I hope I can prove to people that blind tasting is not a hoax, that through training we can actually get more accurate. And it's not even more accurate than chance, but it's even more accurate than the frequency distribution of the wines that you're working with in the first place. And in terms of accuracy within group agreement, we thought for grape variety was something that worked very well with training. So even within 36 days, we got people to improve on how accurate they were in agreeing with each other on what the grape variety might be, and also on identifying correctly the grape variety. And also acidity, we saw an improvement in structural accuracy. But also this showed that prior experience actually matters. So in terms of guessing the region of where the wine is from, we think this is something that takes more than 36 days to train, and that it takes repeated exposure in order to be good at that. And most interestingly, I think for people who are interested in, say, selling wine in developing wine markets, for people where the consumer base is getting more and more educated, there is a preference shift towards wines that are more mature and more structured. So beyond just your red, fruity, easy drinking oak bombs. So thank you for your attention, and I hope to take questions later on.